I'm going to tell you the scariest true story ever told, over thousands of years, in thousands of versions with different names and minute details, but the story always ends the same way, with the next end of the world. We'll give you the short version first, and then the burden of proof will fall here to present the evidence across time and topic that the slow crawl of geology, the wind, water, fire, and tectonic creep is punctuated in rare occasions by disastrous upheaval. The Earth's magnetic field reverses, with dramatic excursion events sprinkled between. They can occur in less than 100 years from plunge to rock bottom. Earth's ongoing magnetic event has already been underway 150 years, into the red zone, and it is speeding up. In early 2019, the magnetic event accelerated to where an update to the world magnetic model was required ahead of schedule for the first time. Well, so far, this has not been causing catastrophic events, but unfortunately there are other aspects to the event coming. Both in physical evidence and in the stories told in rock and voice, the Sun plays the role of the destroyer. Where the decadal and centennial cycles of activity converge, we find the entire magnetic potential of the Sun accessible for what can only be described as a micronova. As unbelievable as that might sound, the evidence will actually show this to be an almost unavoidable consequence of the solar system trip through the galaxy. There is evidence that the crust and mantle unlock at the low velocity zone. The plates collide and may be worse, triggering volcanoes and sending unfathomable amounts of water into the land, creating surge deposits of bone and earth. The earthquakes and volcanoes and tsunamis are followed by snow, ice, incredible amounts falling by the yard as Earth's temperature plummets. We'll see evidence at the micro scale of the previous great solar blast, the ways in which humans survived the last great catastrophe, the evidence that similar plans are secretly unfolding beneath our feet, and the evidence demonstrating the cover-up and erroneous geological science that overthrew a course of rediscovery. One that can now lead us to understand that the Sun's cyclical passage through the galactic electric sheet is the trigger for the great catastrophe cycle on Earth. Let's begin in the 1700s, with a surge of global exploration in science and the discovery of the evidence for these cycles. A dozen researchers became dozens in the 1800s as more evidence and excitement and terror over the implications of the evidence was mounting in an undeniable charge to science to explain all the evidence. The 1900s saw a further growth of the field. Many researchers gained considerable fame, while others were silenced. The end of the century saw the birth of the plasma universe connection to catastrophism, with the first global study of petroglyphs describing a solar catastrophe in antiquity. The story truly begins, relevantly however, with the man almost certainly responsible for the misdirection of the truth, Charles Hapgood. His Earth crust displacement theory became the torch for the catastrophe cycle, and when it bombed, it took down the entire field with it. We will demonstrate his motive and opportunity to cheat Einstein, that he knew the truth, he covered it up. A key element of that cover-up occurred in the 1960s, when a theatrical, extravagant, and shock-driven Hollywood-style description of the catastrophe was classified by the CIA. That is one mystery. Why this one when so many others had discussed the topic for years, for centuries? Could it be that this one contained something unique? When it was declassified and released in 2016, it was heavily sanitized down to only 57 pages, but even those pages deliver incredible bounty, and that is where we will begin, with just another of the thousands of versions of this story, one we will show to be partly right and partly wrong in the rest of this video, but either way, which endows upon you the mindset required to take this journey with us. As dozens of researchers and CIA co-founder Charles Hapgood himself put out their own versions of the story, here is Chapter 1 of the only work on the catastrophe that was classified. With a rumble so low as to be inaudible, growing, then fuming into a thundering roar, the earthquake starts. Only it's not like any earthquake in recorded history. In California, the mountains shake like ferns in a breeze. The mighty Pacific rears back and piles up into a mountain of water more than 2 miles high, then starts its race eastward. With the force of 1,000 armies, the wind attacks. Within 3 hours, the fantastic wall of water moves across the continent, burying the wind-ravaged land under 2 miles of seething water coast to coast. Central America suffers the same cannonade. South America finds the Andes not high enough to stop the cataclysmic violence pounded out by nature in her berserk rage. In less than a day, Ecuador, Peru, western Brazil are shaken madly by the devastating earthquake, burned by molten earth fire, buried under cubic miles of torrential Pacific seas, and then turned into a frozen hell. Everything freezes. Man, beast, plant, and mud are all rock hard in less than 4 hours. Europe cannot escape the onslaught. Western Africa and the sands of the Sahara vanish in nature's wrath. The area bounded by the Congo, South Africa, and Kenya suffers only severe earthquakes and wind. Survivors there marvel at the sun standing still in the sky for nearly half a day. As the Arctic basin leaves its polar home, eastern Siberia, Manchuria, China, and Burma are subjected to the same annihilation as South America: wind, earth fire, inundation, and freezing. The Bay of Bengal basin, just east of India, is now at the North Pole. The Pacific Ocean, just west of Peru, is at the South Pole. Australia is the new, unexplored continent in the North Temperate Zone, with only a few handfuls of survivors populating its vastness. The cataclysm has done its work well, and drives the pitiful few who survive into a new Stone Age. Once more, the Earth has shifted its shell, with the poles moving almost to the equator in a fraction of a day. Again, the atmosphere and oceans, refusing to change direction with the Earth's shell, have wiped out almost all life. After this tumble, we'll join Noah, Adam and Eve, Atlantis, Mu, and Olympus. So that paints a pretty terrible picture. If not for the fact that it was classified by the CIA, it might be worth ignoring entirely as science fiction. And indeed, that version is too extreme, but the evidence does suggest a slightly lesser version of that same event does indeed occur during these upheavals. Now, it is our job to show you the evidence from start to finish, and these are the points we will need to hit to do so. First, we will have to begin with the cover-up, with the manner in which this entire topic of Earth cataclysms went from one of the most important in geophysics to total pseudoscience. It was one of the greatest cover-ups in history. We will then go through the evidence that we have to look to the sun. We'll see how it is cyclically triggered to outburst as we look to the sanitized portion of the Adam and Eve story that is still technically classified but has been leaked past the threshold of action. We'll discover the nature of the solar outburst from the sequence of events and the evidence left on Earth, the nature of the catastrophe. We'll look into the pole reversal and exactly what it is and what it means for us, the impactors and their connection to the event, and finally, survival into the next age of Earth. It was not until the story by Chan Thomas was put into the public that the science of catastrophism could once again progress, and that story begins with the cover-up that really began with the predecessor organization to the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services. The initial question is, why was this version of the book classified? What makes this version of the story unique? Well, certainly this version of the story is quite extreme, a one-day shift of geologic proportion that sends the sea from its beds and tears the world apart. The most critical aspect of the work is the fact that it highlights a repeating, cyclical nature to the event on Earth. Then again, nearly everyone who studied the catastrophe over the last 300 years came to that same conclusion. In the 1940s, one of the most critical scenes of this theater played out at the North Pole. Major Maynard E. White led the first mission to map and understand the Arctic region, mostly because of navigational concerns and to monitor for Soviet attacks over the pole. When it became imperative to locate the magnetic pole position, the scientists found much more than they bargained for when they got their boots on the ground. They found evidence of marine strata, lifted to significant altitude, time after time, and with tropical corals found in that Arctic region strata, complementing the evidence of similar fossils found by Admiral Byrd in Antarctica, both complementing the prehistoric trees unearthed in Norway which had no rings, indicating that they resided at the equator. All in all, Major White's team believed that they had unearthed 9 levels of catastrophe on the planet. These findings were reported at the Pentagon, attended also by Paul Sipple of the RAND Corporation and presumably members of the Office of Strategic Services, where Charles Hapgood was a key player in geophysics. And working with Major White's findings and Dr. Sippel's experiments, it was concluded that Earth's magnetic pole began slowly accelerating, followed by a whip around the geographic polar region, which somehow tilts the planet back and forth, which is why there is evidence of the polar regions in the same places over and over, because it always tilts right back and appears to have not moved over geologic time. They confirmed the catastrophe aspects of the new mountain range creation and ice age conditions immediately following the great event. Charles Hapgood, Paul Sipple, and the Pentagon are perhaps the most credible advocates of this 10 to 12,000 year cycle of disaster on Earth, especially when you consider what they did next. Hapgood continued his classified life while also teaching at various universities up through the late 60s. During the 50s, in the years following Major White's Arctic mission, Charles Hapgood stepped into the limelight in his public life with the famous Earth's crust displacement theory. It was a much mutated version from what we heard from Major White, where the poles do not go back and forth to the same places, the cycle is twice as long, and instead of a one-day event, it takes thousands of years to complete, and which was easily debunked by modern geophysicists, taking down the entire science of catastrophism with it. That is the famous version with the foreword written by Albert Einstein. That is not disputed, as his work with Hapgood was well known in the years before he died. However, Einstein was likely privy to the same information as Hapgood, and the final book came out after he died. There is no way of knowing if Einstein supported the radically different version that Hapgood eventually espoused. But what we do know is that Einstein saw the cycle of catastrophe and the turning over of the Earth. He was looking for a way to unlock the crust from the low-velocity zone in the years before he died, and we know he never did find a sufficient geophysical mechanism. Hapgood's version of the story, the public one, does not match what he and Sipple delivered to Major White at the Pentagon a decade earlier. It does not match the geological evidence or the timelines as well. Hapgood's versions, again, were easily debunked. Now, Einstein discussed this for years with Hapgood, and the only contribution was a foreword. Maybe. But, armed with that foreword, the weak version of crust displacement Hapgood placed over the field had the credibility to do so. The Chan-Thomas version matches the version that somehow got lost between the Pentagon and Charles Hapgood's public life, and it was in fact classified in the years after Hapgood's work, the first work to deviate from that flawed story since the flawed story came out. It plainly contradicts the version that the CIA geophysicist Charles Hapgood was promoting around the world, even if he had promoted a different one in private. And Chan's version got classified, as apparently did that real version of the story reported from what Major White and Paul Sipple provided. Einstein's key problem was the evidence of Greenland's tilting action, but a lack of weight in ice to pull the crust itself. Nobody had ever before discovered a mechanism for how the Earth would actually accomplish this unfathomable disrespect of inertia, basic physics, common logic. Frankly, the explanations blaming the hand of God had about as much evidence as anything else up until that point. That is, until the version Chan-Thomas tried to put out. The postlude of Chan's work was not part of the sanitized release by the CIA, but it was included in a 1993 version of the book the CIA apparently didn't feel the need to classify due to the disrepute of the field of catastrophism. Nobody cares anymore. The postlude describes the only potential mechanism for connection of all the evidence from beneath our feet out to the sun. In recent years, the move in cosmology to see the galactic magnetic field structure as coherent, including the central torus and jet model, has run through the national labs and NASA with incredible success. But one of the lesser publicized realizations of this fact is the scaled similarity with the solar system and with Earth's equatorial ion emission. You see, just like the solar system, the galaxy has an electromagnetic current sheet rippling around the equator, separating the coherent fields of north and south. Now, in our solar system, The sheet ripples, wavering around the equator, bringing a spike in ion density and a reversal of the interplanetary magnetic fields. At Earth, although our orbit only crosses the exact solar equator twice per year, the solar electric current sheet hits Earth every 2 weeks and can produce a geomagnetic storm, inducing electric currents in the atmosphere and the ground. Earth is constantly protected by its own magnetic field, but in addition to things like solar flares, simply enduring a every 2 week solar system magnetic reversal and current sheet impact can cause those electromagnetic disruptions. So, what happens when the Sun and solar system encounter the galactic version, its spike in density, and its magnetic reversal process? Let's actually add one more element to that puzzle: the dust. In our own solar system, and most we see, there is a dusty plain. Like Saturn's rings, density is low from planet formation over time, but in the galaxy that is not the case. There are dusty remnants of countless nova and material left over from the star formation events of the galaxy. So the galactic sheet is more ion dense, a galactic magnetic reversal, and a much more dusty region than we find in our own solar system. Now, out of those three, it might seem like the galactic magnetic field reversal and the extra ion and electron density are the scarier propositions than the dust. But in fact, it might be the dust that makes the situation so awful. To understand why, we must investigate a phenomenon known as recurrent nova.
There are quite a number of these recurrent nova that we do know of. Here's an interesting picture of one called T-Pix. And by the way, this first image was the T-Pix nova of 1997, and this was the T-Pix nova of 2011. It just goes boom over and over and over again. Beautiful plasma physics swinging into view with how they're pretty sure the eruptive character is when it comes to at least this one recurrent nova. And so what this is here, and this list will be ever expanding, these are the current recurring nova in the Milky Way, with the exception of the one that was just discovered about a week and a half ago that was in the Large Magellanic Cloud. I don't know if they're going to count that one as being in the Milky Way or not. But take a look over, it's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th column where it has a bunch of years. Those are the known outburst years. Just take a look at how many times these ones have actually gone boom, some of them. All of the lectures that students are hearing right now and some of the best literature reviews on this topic that you can find very much conclude one thing on this list. It is egregiously under-inclusive. They say that our viewing of the heavens at this level is so nascent that there are almost certainly supernova that we have seen that aren't supernova, that we will see them go boom again, and they will make this list. They believe that there are many with hundreds to thousands of year cycles that we simply have not seen go boom even once. And when we do, we'll have no idea it's a recurrent nova for hundreds to thousands of years more. And so, come to ask what the trigger mechanism is. And it is currently thought to be close-in binaries that is feeding material down onto one of the other stars and basically causes a thermonuclear explosion on the surface.
There is no doubt that some recurrent nova are binaries feeding material down onto their partners, exploding in dramatic fashion. But this has implications for stars with dusty encounters on their way through the galaxy. Apart from dusty filaments and gaseous clouds, the central current sheet is going to have a higher dust density coinciding with the extra energetic particles. This is due to the same mechanism that allows a static duster to work in your home. That electric field is going to contain a surplus of that dusty material, and indeed, we're learning that the dust content overall may be much greater than we realized. The same mechanism described for recurrent nova binaries works on some level for these stellar dusty encounters, except with the current sheet, we also have a surplus of electromagnetic particles as well, all during a galactic magnetic field reversal. The proposal for what that could mean for a sun that is known to have the ability to produce rare superflare type outbursts already is something close to the stories of our ancestors insisting the sun has a dark side.
Why did this all kick off when they came back from the moon? It's because while probably 90%, maybe more, of the glass on the moon is from meteoritic impact or from volcanism on the moon, Probably. There is unquestionably these classes of glasses that are not from volcanoes and that are not from meteorite impacts, specifically the ones that have aluminum-26. The relativistic temperature required for that would require a meteor that to hit the moon big enough such that we would no longer have a moon.
Many astronomers, physicists have hypothesized that at one time there was an immense solar outburst from the sun, maybe 100,000 times what it is right now. Tommy Gold was one of the first to suggest this hypothesis, and it has been followed up by other people. So many physicists, many astronomers believe that in the past, millennia ago, there was an intense solar outburst, and so I'm going to pursue that.
One that I have been focused on lately has been the antediluvian, the so-called biblical flood, if you will. On average, about every 10,000 years, you can expect a catastrophe to happen. For the most part, the civilization is wiped out. It's a horrendous catastrophe. It wipes out a pre-existing civilization and most of the people on Earth. And so we must start anew.
Through decades of searching the world collaborations with amazing observers like John McGovern, Herat has amassed the most extensive data set of petroglyph representation of global solar storms, and the most famous of those is the Stickman, which is not amazing by itself, but those dots on each side, found around the world from the exact same time periods, is indicative of shared experience, and the plasma formation called a Z-pinch seems to fit the description of both the drawings and the physics of a solar disaster.
There's two events happening here. When the sun novas, the heat from that nova and also cosmic rays, we get within 8 minutes of when the sun novas. Now remember, for another 17 to 18 hours, that dust shell is still on the way. It hasn't hit until, I estimate, 17 to 18 hours after the nova. So the first thing happens is the surface is going to get melted and glazed. Ironically, the Torah winds up saying the moon turned red. Well, yeah, it turned red. It just got baked and melted. That's the glazing that Thomas Gold and others had noticed all around the place. Then the dust shell hits 17, 18 hours later. Several assumptions. One, you can't assume that this dust shell is homogeneous because the evidence we've seen both on the Earth and on the Moon, they have the different samples they brought back from Apollo 11, 16, 17, a few others. They had different chemical compositions. It was the same stuff they found in the South Pole and other places on the Earth. So when they say it impacts like another meteor, remember, these scientists can't think in terms of a sun noving. What I'm trying to tell everybody, this is not an easy process that happens. It's a complicated one. It's not just the sun. It's not just that the Earth stops its rotation and the oceans keep going. It's also the crust of the Earth, just like the oceans, are going to start banging up against each other. So after the moon gets glazed by and melted by the sun's nova, 17, 18 hours later, the dust shell comes and puts a fresh new load of dust on top of it. I mean, they're grasping for straws because they don't know where else or how else to explain it. Here they get a sample, matter in their hand, and they got a bunch of holes in it. A lot of the samples they're getting from Antarctica and other places, they don't know to try to get the fission tracks. Look for fission tracks. The stuff that came back from the moon in 69 and through the 70s, they were smart enough to look for fission tracks, and they found plenty of them. In fact, all the Gillespie, almost all the Gillespie that I know of, had fission tracks in it, and about 5 or 6 different radioactive elements. Aluminum-26, beryllium-10, a bunch of them, that could only have been formed from a stellar nova. You know, you have to have relativistic temperatures.
I don't know what this is, John, here at me, Houston, but I'm going to pick it up because... anything that stares at you, you better pick up. It's a glass but in this sunlight, it's reflecting red, green, like a rainbow. Found the first prism on the moon, John. Something like that. 10 rock frags, a couple of which are, one of which is some interesting black glass along the sides of it. Another which is covered with black glass, and many little glass beads all over the place here, John. Oh, boy. That was one of those fractures that's all included with glass. See that, Charlie? Yeah, so those glass fracture sets. I think the after on this one will be pretty interesting. Here's a rock with glass splatter all over its body. Hey, Tony, I just picked up one that is in bag 15 that is has a black matrix, bluish black matrix with lap-like either clast or phenocryst in it. And it's right behind the limb here. I don't know whether that's what we're looking for or not. Okay, that sounds good, Charlie.
This seems to be one of the main reasons. In fact, all these missions talk about this. They talk about this glass splatter and these glass debris samples they're picking up on the moon, which makes me believe that they were up there looking for glass splatters. They were looking for evidence of solar effects on the moon. And I think that the Chinese went up there on the far side of the moon to do exactly the same thing.
You do that in West Texas and you get a rattlesnake. Here you get permanently shattered soil.
How about rolling that one over?
No way. Whitish to gray with a lot of zap pits in it.
Those that naked. Those are zap pits, aren't they?
Yeah. In fact, Tony, the whole area, there's a lot of this rock. There's a lot of this rock here.
These are interesting because they had a glazed surface on top, the 64455 sample. It was this glazed top on it. And then in another part of that sample, there were all these pellet shots in it. I think it's a very, very strong evidence path that our sun has a micronova event on a very regular period of time, and that we're seeing these samples on the moon as evidence of these events.
A consistency of reports from around the world of catastrophes that are amazingly similar. But a lot of people thought it's just what people dream up when they have a lot of time or they're dreaming or whatever. It's just stuff that people naturally come up with. Velikovsky thought it was catastrophes that people witnessed and remembered as very different.
What's called the 4 o'clock rapids, 56 concentric. Actually, it's less than that because these have started to undergo rotation. Here's one on the Navajo Reservation, Bronze Shield, 3rd millennium, Middle East. This is a 56 ray from Kazakhstan. Somebody locked the doors because at this point people are going to start escaping, but this is a 56 ray Circle Axis Mundi from China. And these are actually drawn as paintbrushes. You know, the Axis Mundi here, the tree coming up in the center. But anyway, the 56 are there. In Arizona, it's the same thing. Pick that one up. This is unfair. I picked the Penumbra of a dense plasma focus, which also has 56, but it's a plasma, so we would expect it.
It's not what they taught you in school because they gave you it nice and coded. But again, remember, the people in the U.S. government who saw the sun flare up and get the information back from the moon when we brought the stuff back, they were mostly scared. The sun does something terrible. They didn't know when. They felt they had no power to change it. See, our tools have shown us things that they couldn't have possibly seen 50 and 70 years ago.
Dome ceiling, 5th Street Church, Seattle. This is very close to the Forbidden City of China ceiling picture. These ceiling pictures show up, and they generally have 56. This is brand new. This is the Grand Atrium in Saudi Arabia, which is brand new. And again, they didn't draw it circular, but they certainly put 8x7 panels of light around here, as well as some structure in the center. That's Neolithic stone ruins. So there are 56 Birkeland filaments in our intense aurora that happened perhaps 4 millennia ago.
And so, Thomas Gold, Bradley Schaefer, Anthony Peratt, Robert Schoch, August Dunning, Douglas Vogt, myself, and literally everybody in the Astronomical Society of Japan, at very, very least, can say that the Carrington event is probably nowhere near as big as the sun can go. The voices from the past supporting this argument come from the Maya, the Aztec, stories in India, China, pagan stories, Aboriginal, African, Polynesian, and those in the Middle East, many of which are recorded in the Bible. During that time, the tunnels were built. During that time, the petroglyphs were carved that blame the sun. Some of the stories actually survived from the pagans of Ragnarok. And this is something that I don't think anyone who studies the sun on long-term scales should really ignore if we're looking to answer the question of what can the sun do to the earth? Because it's one thing to look back at our ancestors and the stories they tell and say, you know what? You guys did a pretty good job inventing geometry, philosophy, architecture, but we're going to just take your most important stories and just going to pretend that you guys are crazy and made them up. That's one giant leap, especially when they could predict eclipses. When somebody wants to build a lander that's going to go onto the moon or it's going to go onto Mars, they have to get as realistic conditions as possible, right? One of the places they get this stuff is the Exolith Lab at Central Florida. We got a bunch of their soils, and we have a bunch here, but you guys remember, we've got a plasma lab, don't we, down in Georgia. The very first time he simulated what this solar flash would do to the moon, to the lunar soil, was absolutely incredible. And then he blasted it. This is the equivalent black glass that they found on the moon. The glazing of some of the rocks that are in there is the exact glazing that was found on the moon. This required no meteoritic impact. It simply required the equivalent of a massive CME or nova shell discharge, or even what is possible through X-rays going through the vacuum. What you got on the left there is a piece of muscovite mica. This was taken here on Earth. It is only the third ever found rare cosmological event, they say. All of the black stuff around there, those are normal fission tracks. That's real cosmic rays. That's what cosmic rays look like when they hit. But there's this exclusion zone around what they call the rare cosmological event. They know for a fact that it's not electrons or positrons, and they represent a residually input positive charge that didn't discharge outward, but it discharged from the center. And it looks exactly like the cosmic jet that blasts out of a star when it's born. It looks like the cosmic jets that you see from the center of a galaxy when it eats a star. And so how do you get a residual positive charge to basically bathe a crystal such that it takes it in and it can't discharge it out? It's still bathed in the stuff. It has to discharge in the center. There's actually missing atoms in the center. Now, they're not really missing. And I would argue that, while not definitive, something tremendous from the sun is not a terrible first hypothesis.
The galactic trigger, the dust and gas mechanism for superflares and recurrent nova, the evidence on the moon, the stories of our ancestors, the global nature of the disaster, all point to the sun as the destroyer. But is it a superflare or a micronova, and does it really matter? To look at this question, we will first investigate the recent history of magnetic events on Earth, starting with the one ongoing now. The key element in this overall process is one that has already begun to unfold again here, and the clock is ticking as we move deeper into the shift. We know that Earth's magnetic field has begun an acceleration beyond its normal wander, and coincident with that is the loss of field strength. Magnetic reversals as rapid as 80 years have been recorded in the paleomagnetic record, and we are already more than double that many years into the current shift. While moving more slowly than the record-fast reversals, things have begun to intensify. The Earth's magnetic field is currently decreasing by approximately 5% per decade, with the north and south magnetic poles set to meet in the eastern Indian Ocean. While the north is moving much faster, the south has already left the continent of Antarctica. The timeline is on the scale of a few decades to 100 years, presuming things don't accelerate any further. Seem impossible? Well, these are the current motions, and that is not disputed. But this magnetic meeting point scenario also has interesting coincidences, and not a one of them is bright and sunny. First, this region was an incredibly interesting place a few years ago, until the data disappeared.
All the information in this video is available for verification via the online buoy database maintained by NOAA. Buoy in event mode, south of Bali. For those who monitor the ocean, this is a familiar sight. The tail of this buoy starts with another and begins long before there was such a thing as Station 53046. You will notice the primary areas of coverage from the Solomon Islands, east to the Kermadec Islands, and up around to Sumatra, all locations of powerful earthquakes in the last few years, except this central three, including 53046 in the middle. Like I said, our story begins with a different buoy, 56003 to the right. She's had a turbulent life, as you can see here. In October of 2008, they put her down, and it was barely a month before the wild readings appeared. She was immediately taken offline. During the time she was down, another buoy was put in, 56001 to the left, put down about 350 days later in October of 2009. She ran fine. 03 came back at a much lower sea depth, but in the exact same location before jumping back up in 2011. Station 56001 began deviating in November of 2011, and one must assume it was about that time they hatched a plan to add the third buoy to the group, 53046. It was a few months later in mid-2012 when she began to send back information, and within a few months the action began. Short but significant drops in the sea depth. This channel began reporting rapid seafloor rise, and the buoy was taken out of commission by the Australian BOM. Clearly it is back and in the exact same place, but when you factor in the further movement of the last 36 hours, more than 100 more meters, which is barely visible here at the end of the chart, we have officially eclipsed the 1200 meter mark, or just about 4,000 feet. This could be volcanic, could be related to the fault destabilization described in many of our previous videos. It looks like this part of the world is a significant place to watch.
One of the biggest alternative news stories of that time was that a few days after this video aired, the buoy disappeared, and to this day both it and its data are gone. Further complicating the story is that this region forms a geographically small triangle with the strongest magnetic point on Earth, the South Magnetic Pole, and with the Dragon's Triangle, Asia's version of the Bermuda Triangle, and indeed, that new pole position is near where those airplanes disappeared in recent years. Now, since one pole might reasonably be expected to emerge on the opposite side of Earth, we find that to be here, in South America or perhaps just offshore, forming a geographically small triangle with the weakest magnetic region on Earth, the South Atlantic Anomaly, and the Bermuda Triangle, where airplanes may have been known to encounter a difficulty or two over time. So the magnetic poles are on a collision course, at a point near the magnetic maximum point of Earth in the Dragon's Triangle, with the other side of the world, where the other pole would be, happening to sit next to the magnetic minimum point of Earth and the Bermuda Triangle. This is not your normal polar wander, this is a true shift, and Earth is already down approximately 20% in magnetic field strength and decreasing. As if all these coincidences aren't enough, there is one more, and it is the big one. The Bay of Bengal Basin, just east of India, is now at the North Pole. The Pacific Ocean, just west of Peru, is at the South Pole. The only version of the catastrophe cycle that was classified by the CIA is also the only one that mentions the Indian Ocean and South America as being the next polar regions after Earth turns over. Again, Chan Thomas's version says that is exactly where the new North and South poles of Earth will be. You might also notice, for the electromagnetically and geometrically inclined among you, that from the new poles to those triangles and maximum and minimum magnetism points, we are forming 90-degree angles. For those who find it difficult to ignore facts lining up, that was 7, including real observation data, geomagnetism, and a sprinkling from the CIA. Now, let's take a step back. We have now come to a point where a considerable compounding of these pieces into a puzzle is required before moving forward. The topic of Earth's catastrophe cycle has been well understood for centuries. past the point of question to the search for a mechanism. It was not until the top-secret geophysicist Charles Hapgood, parading as professor and author, put out a mutated version of the story that the topic itself became taboo for respectable scientists, and that version, easily debunked, never matched the evidence or the conclusions from the internal intelligence community of the day, of which Hapgood was a part. Einstein's final problem was not understanding how the crust unlocks from the mantle, not whether or not it occurs, and exactly how you disrupt the entire planet. They never looked outside the Earth. The physical evidence and the stories that have survived point to the sun, and so does the mechanism currently believed to work for superflares and recurrent nova. The key element of this process on Earth, the magnetic reversal, has already begun and is accelerating, and this indicates that we are entering the central galactic current sheet already, and it is clear what that dust, ions, and magnetic field change means for the stars that we see experience them on a much more regular basis. It means the type of thing that the geniuses of the past, who gave us philosophy, geometry, and architecture, found so crushing that they blamed gods.
I decided that a magnetic reversal had an awful lot to do with the dinosaur extinction. And then the more I researched, I realized that magnetic reversals also, as far as I'm concerned, trigger ice ages, and that they return in a cycle, in a regular pattern that we should actually be able to predict.
When you have the onset of an ice age, of course, here's the conundrum. The conundrum is that you've got to have a very large, rapid accumulation of glacial ice, which requires that the climate be cold enough that ice does not disappear through seasonal melting. At the same time, you have to increase the amount of evaporation from the oceans in order to loft this much moisture into the air that can precipitate out as snow that ultimately is compressed into glacial ice. The problem is, as you can see, is that it requires heat. So there's the kinds of conundrums that we're confronted with when looking at this. See, our predecessors from a few generations ago had it a lot easier because they could imagine that the whole process took 100,000 years or longer. We don't have that luxury anymore.
So what is going to happen to us? For that, we look back past the current shift to the last one, the last few, actually. And few people have cataloged the repeating magnetic disaster in the last few decades, as well as Douglas Vogt and Robert Felix. Although there is some question as to the exact timeline of the events, there is a series of global disasters that involve major magnetic events on Earth, surge deposits from inundations of the sea, filled with the bones of millions of animals, and the deposition, thereafter, of incredible amounts of snow and ice. The evidence paints the scariest possible picture of the near future on Earth. Felix and Vogt have done the best job analyzing the last few great geomagnetic events. The last one was the Gothenburg event. It is believed to have occurred between 10,000 and 13,000 years ago. 40 years after its discovery, there is still new evidence being unearthed, mostly leaning towards the latter side of that scale. The data on the Mono Lake and Lake Mungo events is all over the place, and to a diligent observer, it actually appears that some of the researchers got those events confused over time, especially the ones in Antarctica. In reality, it was almost certainly two events, one nearer to the 24,000 years ago range and another closer to 35,000 years ago. The last Champ event is probably the most well-studied excursion, and it was a tremendous hardship on the biosphere, one of the worst we know of. Lastly, the Antarctic cores from Vostok do show another event in addition to the lake event about 35,000 years ago, and this one is about 60,000 years ago, which does allow us to find one more solid event before the data is mostly lost amid erosion and time and geology. And so if we consider the lake events at the two boundaries of that time data zone, we basically have an event slightly less often than once every 10,000 years. Whether it is an exact cycle or not, the 11 to 13,000 year range appears to be solid, and so about 12,000 years from the last one, and with Earth's magnetic field starting to shift already, and with only decades to go according to the math, less if things accelerate, there is every reason to believe that the long cycle timing and observable changes happening now are not coincidence, or at very least, you cannot presume it is a coincidence, at least not with what's at stake. A recent paper in the world's #1 geophysics journal highlights this disaster that looms on the geological horizon, but it's not something that happens hundreds of thousands of years apart.
We call them excursions, magnetic excursions, which is, a term that's well integrated in the literature now. And these are very short-lived reversals, but they're associated with minima in field intensity, and it's the minima in field intensity that are implicated because when you have low field strength, you enhance UVR.
How do you go from the heat and energetic input of the solar blast to an ice age? The answer will ultimately determine whether a solar aspect is a superflare or a micronova.
Sometimes admitting you don't know, at least your mind is open to look for more evidence. Right now, the pressing issue is, if I'm right that this next Gleisberg cycle is going to be when the reversal happens, I'm going to be like 99 years old. And some of you are probably not going to make it either in 27 years. But it's for the children and grandchildren and the unborn generations.
Oddly, as vastly more energetic as a nova event would be than a solar flare, it may bring about more of the cooling effects to our planet. To explain the ice ages occurring with the magnetic reversals, we must actually look to either that nova-like event or the tilting of the Earth's crust, which vexed Einstein for a solution he never found beneath our feet. The sun does not bulge, in blatant disrespect of physics. It has a secret. Its cycles always build to greater crescendos, and the great solar blast could truly disrupt our entire planet. While Vogt does not advocate for a tilt of Earth, he does advocate for a reversal of rotation. The stories of the sun rising in the wrong place. The stories of the long night where tribes believed the sun might never rise again. The stories of the sun standing still in the sky. All of those ancient stories from around the world complement those found in the rock. Interestingly, either a 90-degree tilt and tilt back and forth, as was described by Chan Thomas, Albert Einstein, and Major White, or the rotation reversal advocated by Vogt, both leave evidence of the poles residing in the same positions over millions of years, cycle after cycle bouncing back to the same places, such that if you were to look over long periods of time, you might think the pole has never moved at all. Here, it is Einstein's hitting a brick wall that actually gives us our best chance to know what's happening. Like Chan Thomas and all who came before him, Einstein saw the tilting of the crust. His problem is that the most likely geophysical actor is Greenland. Its massive ice weight creates an uneven distribution of mass in the northern hemisphere, which due to centrifugal force of the planet's rotation, wants to spin at the equator. The problem of geophysics, which Einstein realized and never overcame, is that Greenland is unlikely to ever gain quite enough ice mass to unlock the rocky crust from the liquid mantle and float freely. It is that unlocking of the crust that is so critical to the crustal tilt possibility. Einstein, Major White, the researchers throughout history, and Chan Thomas are all focusing on what's known as the low velocity zone, a thin barrier between the rocky crust and fluid mantle, but which acts like plastic due to a delicate thermoelectric equilibrium, meaning the temperature and electrical activity create the plasticity and the friction. If that equilibrium were to be disrupted, it would allow the crust to float freely on the mantle, and allow for any number of tilt or plate collision scenarios to occur. Well, how do you disrupt the thermoelectric equilibrium that's creating the low velocity zone? A major solar blast. Such an eruption would immediately change viscosity in the magma due to cosmic ray bombardment, and also cause temperature changes, which would only add to the temperature changes resulting from any induced currents that resulted when the shockwave hit Earth's magnetic field. Those events are indeed globally induced, and they are electric. We may also scale up the two known drivers of length of day glitches. Believe it or not, those are real. They are usually small glitches, self-correcting or spread over long periods of time, and are either caused by major solar storms, geomagnetic jerks from Earth's core, or in the case of the longer-term variations, Earth's long-term magnetic field changes. Now, since the length of day means we are talking about rotation speed and crustal motion atop the mantle, it bears mentioning that in the greatest solar storm imaginable, which could induce current all the way to Earth's core if we know modern-day blasts can affect the mantle, makes for possibly combining the two causes of rotation speed glitches in the same energetic solar mechanism that would satisfy the ancient stories, disrupt the low-velocity zone, and unlock the crust. We are now at the second time we have found ourselves confronting way too many coincidences to ignore. So, is it a micronova or a superflare? A recent study has confirmed that magnetization reversal of an entire body of material can occur simply with the application of an appropriate electric field. A superflare has the energy to electrically disrupt the entire solar system, let alone one piece of one planet, potentially unlocking the low-velocity zone, and the tilted crust thereafter freezes brand new locations at the poles, puts ice at the equator to reflect sunlight, cool the air, release cold freshwater melt, and fog from the process that would further block out sunlight. If it is a nova, regardless of any crustal or rotation events, there would be a dusty remains in the inner solar system and in the atmosphere for weeks, months, and maybe longer. The sun would be dimmed as though from a volcanic winter, and those volcanoes are part of this event as well, if you'll recall, adding to the freezing in both situations. This is what the scientists have studied for centuries. This is what they have been trying to explain. This is what we have coming again to Earth as a new cycle and Novus Tempus, a new age, begins again. Nova or superflare, you may be able to get there both ways.
It's a little bit difficult to go back and to say, well, the story is not exactly so. We have the phenomena from all places, from the bottom of the sea with ash and with nickel, which is of meteoric origin. The terrestrial axis moved. And that paleomagnetism proves us that terrestrial axis, that magnetic axis, and possibly like Runcorn and other of Manchester, claim that the Earth turned over. We know now from observation of Professor Danjon, director of Paris Observatory, that flares on the sun may influence the speed of rotation of the Earth, and there were sudden changes. We generally don't like to know that we are traveling on a accident-prone planet.
What were all these ancient people saying? What were all these people trying to remember? We must take the words left to us in generations of oral histories and written records of observations in the sky as instances of events that were not the norm. They were so important and unusual that they have come through time as warnings left by our brothers and sisters of the ancient past. These events were not lunar eclipses or earthquakes. Now in this time, with our understanding of celestial mechanics, atmospheric, and geological sciences, we must try to make sense of these recorded events and untangle them from worship and prophecy. It's time to look at them for what they actually provide as a roadmap of things to come. We can ask the question, has the Earth stopped rotating for any length of time in recorded history? And the voices call out to us from the ancient Middle East. The book of Joshua in 1405 BC. O sun, stand still over Gibeon. O moon, over the valley of Aijalon. 1013. The sun stood still, and the moon stood motionless while the nation took vengeance on its enemies. The event is recorded in the scroll of the Upright One. The sun stood motionless in the middle of the sky. It did not set for a full day. And those same voices call out to us from ancient Peru. Also in 1405 BC, the 40th Inca Capac was Pachacuti, the reformer that started the worship of the sun god Inti. In 1405 there occurred a frightening darkness. Quote, good customs were forgotten, and people were given to all manner of vice. There was no dawn for 20 hours. After a great outcry, confessions of sins and sacrifices and prayers, the sun finally rose. Has the world experienced a global cataclysm before? And will it happen again? And what was remembered, and how is it described to begin again? The voices call out from the ancient American Indians, and this is the ninth and last sign. You will hear a dwelling place in the heavens above the earth that shall fall in a great crash. It will appear as a blue star. Very soon after this, the ceremonies of my people will cease. Has this cataclysm happened before? the voices call out from ancient China. There were seen fire-breathing dragons leaping into the sky. They call out from ancient Siberia. The earth was on fire from both horizons. And they call again from the ancient past in the voices of the Inca. At the Intihuatana was a stone cut with great precision to observe and measure the movements of the sun. The name meant that which binds the sun, and it makes it return, lest it disappear, returning the earth into a darkness that had occurred once before, according to the legends. Did the Inca, Chinese, Siberians, and the rest remember the last micronova event in their oral histories? We need to take these people seriously.
Now let's take a moment for the respect of geophysics and things like basic inertia of the Earth's rotation being unimaginably unstoppable. That indeed is the current prison from which Earth's catastrophe cycle must escape. The tilting of Earth's crust is restrained by the evidence that the poles and the ice existing at the polar regions have done so for millions of years, and both the tilting crust and Vogt's rotation reversal are battling the force of inertia of our rotation. The reason that the poles and ice matter is because the entire topic of catastrophe was umbrellaed under Charles Hapgood's absurd version, where 7-degree tilts happen randomly and over 1,000 years and never tilted back to put the poles in their original positions. This concept was easily debunked, and there went the field of study. However, the previous versions to Hapgood's, Vogt's rotation change, Major White's insider version, and the Chan-Thomas classified version all put the poles in the same places over millions of years. Furthermore, the most highly cited work on past pole positions, which was used to debunk Hapgood's work, and which was used to crush the field of catastrophes as a whole, actually has a correction paper published, which was cited far, far less often, and which nobody really remembers. But it changed the past pole positions from the original publication, in some cases to the point where the original paper had them on the opposite side of the planet, as wrong as you can be with a polar search. Another of the well-cited papers debunking the polar motion came from a bachelor's student at Columbia. While in theory, a major paper does not require a major degree. This student worked under the CIA-controlled programs at Columbia, at the time when it was becoming so rampant and overbearing that the local community had begun an uproar. This is how you control a scientific theory, whether we further investigate the problem of the poles in the past or we cling to the concepts that don't require them. The only reason this topic is considered pseudoscience is because a wildly mutated version of the story was put out by a CIA agent masquerading as a professor, and which somehow overthrew the centuries of study and literally the world of evidence.
One of the things that you and I have been talking about are the idea of these micronova events on the sun, these periodic cyclical eruptions on many stars based on the Kepler-2 satellite data, and that as this stuff is sprayed out into the universe around in our solar system, and these things could have been blasted out from the sun in these periodic explosions, and that could have been deposited on the moon, on Earth, on Mars. The fact that they're only about 12 miles down indicates they're not deep penetrator meteor impacts. So it leads me now to believe that these magnetic anomalies, if not all of them, certainly some of them, could be from solar eruptions. And this is just solar material that is splattered out and these planets have run into in this huge cloud of debris once the sun releases these nova events.
End of the last ice age, we had catastrophic rains, catastrophic flooding. I believe this goes along with the solar outburst at the time, which caused glacial melting virtually instantaneously in the ice core records and in the sediment records, but particularly the ice core record. We see that we snapped out the end of the last ice age virtually overnight. I mean, literally the microstratigraphy is that accurate, and what happens to, what could be the cause of coming out of the ice age so quickly. We're talking an incredible temperature increase, And based on many lines of evidence I've now been accumulating, I'm convinced this was a major solar outburst, a major solar event. I'm now convinced that we have direct evidence on the Giza Plateau of a, quote, lightning strike, unquote, which would not be a lightning strike in the sense of normal thunderstorms, that type of thing. But I'm convinced that it probably is indicative of what was happening at the end of the last ice age, and that the Giza Plateau itself was literally hit during the solar outburst. But I now am convinced that we have on the plateau direct evidence of this, as we have elsewhere on Earth, and it turns out on the plateau was found something known as the inventory stela, and this is something I've been studying in great detail with my colleague Dr. Manu Safzadeh, and it talks about Khufu, the supposed builder of the Great Pyramid, acknowledging that the Sphinx was already there and that the Sphinx had been struck by, quote, lightning in much more ancient times.
The lightning strike that he speaks of is between the second pyramid and the Sphinx. So the pyramid with the capstone, if you will, there that's still intact, and between that and the Sphinx, the back end of the Sphinx. So it's vitrification everywhere and a big scar going deep into the ground.
We have major vitrification because of this, quote, lightning strike. And again, I would stress it's well beyond anything that you would get with normal atmospheric, thunderstorms. But vitrification there, I'm convinced, as we're finding elsewhere, that ties in with the phenomena, and I'll use the term cataclysm at the end of the last ice age. When you have vitrification at this level on something like the Giza Plateau, it cannot be a meteorite or a comet or an asteroid, because that would have literally destroyed
the monument.
You wouldn't have the monuments left. On the inventory stela, it talks about this huge lightning bolt knocking off part of the back, basically, of the Sphinx.
There is a concern for the lower-level L-shell magnetic fields, the smaller arches instead of the global fields connecting to the polar regions. In most solar blasts, even the worst ones we only see every decade or so now, the magnetosphere of Earth compresses down to those outer L-shells, but still connects to the polar region in the most exposed outer zones. But in the extreme scenario, it could be very different. The modeling of the Great Solar Storm of 1859, for example, which lit telegraph wires on fire and shocked operators, came close to hitting the lowest level L shells. And if that were to actually happen on Earth in a superflare or micronova, then you get the potential for a magnetar-type discharge, where its own processes are thought to surge energy through its L shell fields, arc down, and literally crack the surface of the star. At that point, the loss of power grids might be one of the lesser concerns. As for the electric geology, lab results confirm this action on terrestrial planets. The only question is, did it happen before, and could it happen again?
You have to bring in new evidence, and it has to adjust your theory, because theories are just theories. Now, one of the interesting things about the Clementine mission is it took magnetic readings of the entire surface of the moon and found the largest magnetic anomalies on the far side of the moon, around von Karman and Leibniz craters on the far side, which is exactly where the Chinese just landed a lander.
Does China know? Does the US government know? All the information shared here is published in major journals, with admittedly a bit of connect the dots as well, trying to fill in the gaps of the researchers throughout history with the tools they didn't have. Certainly it seems like the CIA had it pegged decades ago, at least the fact that there was a cyclical catastrophe, and perhaps as early as Major White's Project Nanook expedition to the North Pole. It all relates to the all-important question of survival in the catastrophe, and the only good news we have to deliver in this presentation. There is evidence of tremendous retreat of the populace into caves and tunnels thousands of years ago, multiple times actually. These tunnels have been reused countless times over history, including during wartime and by smugglers, but their purpose was once to house the humans who, for some reason, could not remain at the surface. As terrible as this event is, we must remember that we are here today, So we have survived countless catastrophes and come out on top of this world. We are survivors. Our government appears to believe it has what it takes for the country to survive. What may have begun as underground shelter for the military elites, and which may have expanded as the result of threat of nuclear war in the mid-20th century, what exists now is a complex, interconnected underground world, far greater in capacity than could ever be needed by the military. One must genuinely begin to ask how many people could fit down there. There are many maps on the internet and lists of deep bunkers and bases, but these are just the ones we know about. Most on these maps are even acknowledged publicly. There's no telling just how much more exists, and how ready the country really is.
The U.S. government knows some of this stuff. They know the sun does nova. There's no debate about that. The question is they don't want you guys to know about it. If it's no longer a secret, there's no point in keeping it a secret. They're desperately looking for any other explanation. Don't look at the sun. That's it.
That same sort of luck that will leave survivors worldwide afar from tsunamis and volcanoes and ice storms will be the same sort of luck made for people by themselves by being prepared and getting that head start. In terms of best chance to prolong your use of these devices, don't rely on batteries. Find a small solar panel, portable, with USB output, and get devices that have USB charging capability. There's no reason you might not be able to use those devices for a long time. A long time. Yes, then there is the long haul. Provided we aren't all whisked underground into an unimaginable catacomb beneath us in the greatest feat of engineering in history, there is no reason you cannot do what your ancestors did. You may not live that way now, and you may be dependent on electricity, but the fact that we know how they lived back then means we have the tools at our fingertips in the age of information. How convenient it would rise before the fall. Here is a bit more on the intellectual side of prepping, but from a non-tangible perspective, a scene from one of the episodes preceding this infomentary. This event would be extreme. You can survive it, but the shock and awe to the circuitry inside is real. If you've ever seen someone in legitimate shock, you know that. That cannot be you if your children are depending on you. This fortress must be ready. A key aspect of mental practice is informational. Situational awareness is key, and as example, I'll use New Mexico, where I live. Good to know where the waterways are, especially in a desert. Even a small stream nearby can be a bounty. If you know about local elevation, that helps too, especially in relation to ocean proximity, snow caps, or other temperature change between peak and canyon at the same latitude. Other sites to know, and everyone knows Carlsbad Caverns around here, so maybe some others might make your list. Certainly the mining operation maps of your local area could be good in case you need to flee cosmic plasma or into the warmer rock of the crust. And for the same reason, the cavern systems of your area are good things to know as well. It is critical that you apply these basic principles to your own situation, for your own awareness, to mitigate the system shock of the event. There is no real way to prepare for what terrified our ancestors, what glazed the moon, and which may happen again. But you simply don't have time to think about these things at that moment. It is as important to understand them now as it is to stock food, water, and seeds. So what are the two key aspects to mental prepping here of the non-tangible nature? First, this event will be shocking, but even knowing what could be coming gives you a heads up on the completely uninformed. Strength is key in those moments when courage is the most elusive. Second, some of you will want to bug out to safe locations, others will want to stay in your castle with all your supplies. That decision cannot be made on the fly. You don't have time to plot a route or figure out if you're staying or going. You don't have time to go get those books at the store. You have to have a certain amount of mental prepping done beforehand. Now, true enough, if your part of the world sinks into the sea like Atlantis, or a piece of a micronova shell lands on your head, there isn't much you're going to do. But for the lucky that will be spared across the world, most will be petrified. A select few will be prepared, will know it's coming, and will have made decisions beforehand. We will have some final questions to answer here, and then I need to summarize the entire story once more with the impetus for awareness and action on the part of everyone alive and for the generations to come. The questions that remain concern the nature of the blast, the stability of Earth's tilt and rotation, and therefore the cause of the Ice Age. What I find most interesting is that if the Sun micronovas every 12,000 years or so, its superflare production must be on a few thousands of years timescale, likely the Hallstatt cycle of around 2,400 years. The nova clearly triggers the cold due to blocking out sunlight, but the superflare lacks the dust and may not unlock the crust. It may be a heating event only. Here we find the differences between Dr. Robert Schoch and Douglas Vogt to be the most prominent, most helpful, and most telling. Dr. Schoch seems to be describing the rapid and cataclysmic end of the Younger Dryas Ice Age, while Vogt is concerned only with how the Younger Dryas cold began. Schoch has also come to focus on the few thousands of year scale, as has Dr. Anthony Peratt, and they may indeed be describing one of the more recent superflare catastrophes. Either one, and we're done. At the end of the day, the evidence on the Earth, the Moon, in other recurrent nova, in the magnetic cycle of Earth, and in the work of Cuvier, Deluc, Hibbins, Einstein, Thomas, and White, we see pointing to a more devastating long-term harmonic of the cycle, where the Sun stands still in the sky at the axis point where the Earth turns over, and where the Sun and galaxy combine as the sword and the hand striking this violence into the biosphere. Some basic math tells us that if the equator spins at 1,000 miles an hour, and it took even as little as 1 hour to stop rotation, it is still only a deceleration of 17 miles per hour per minute, not the kind of thing that's going to throw you against the wall. And while it would inundate the coastal regions like a massive global tsunami, it would not raise the Pacific 2 miles high, and something tells me 1 hour is too fast, making the push potentially even less. But still, there is evidence of waves taking out entire continents, and so the rise and fall of land like Atlantis, Mu, and Lemuria must be considered. The last one of these events appears to have been about 12,000 years ago. The magnetic field of Earth has begun to shift and accelerate, indicating that the solar system may be entering this electric current sheet and galactic magnetic reversal region already. If so, the current rate of change gives us 2 to 3 generations, and that is if it does not speed up anymore. A similar speed up to the 1900s or the first decade of this century could push us over the edge at any time. The Sun cannot hide from the Earth, its only weakness. Knowledge is power here in the most obvious form. We have all the tools to remain informed and track the Sun, the magnetic field, and seismic activity at the low velocity zone of Earth. If I may leave you with 2 final thoughts. First, modern science emboldens the position of Einstein, Chan Thomas, and Major White. And second, we are better equipped than any civilization in history. It is your choice whether you succumb to fear or disbelief, or if you make the time to be informed and prepared, just in case.
There's more evidence to be uncovered right beneath our feet. In July 2019, they discovered that the Florida shell beds contained micro-tektite glass beads of space origin, so I decided to go get some. The professors were very kind. The shell beds are beyond anything I would have imagined, and they let me take various samples with me. We have shells from various layers of strata, including burned layers and those that are more pristine. We believe much of the treasure lies in the material packed and preserved inside the larger shells, of which we have many. We will search for the glass beads in these samples and try to do fission trap testing. They did it for the lunar soil, but they skipped it with the glass beads on Earth. Do they have transuranic elements? Aluminum-26? I want to find out.
Hey, welcome, fellow observers. I hope you enjoyed that full-length movie. I'd just like to thank Ben for putting that together. That is no easy task. You may recognize my voice. So I'm a frequent contributor on the Fly on the Wall podcast. I am an often presenter at the Observing the Frontier, and I'm reporting to you live from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is actually the town where Ben and I grew up next door to each other. So it's been a very long and interesting and exciting journey together that we've all taken. Adam and Eve's story. By Chan Thomas. So we actually in our possession have a copy of this book. And if you check out the website suspectsky.com, you'll be interested to see that there are PDF versions for download for free, available to the public. For all of you that are watching this video, you've done a tremendous thing. You have educated and made yourself aware of probably the biggest and most important story facing our Earth today, and that is the pending catastrophe cycle.
Another thing, we didn't even get a chance to talk really much about Mars. There's direct evidence of a major crustal shift on Mars. There are these magnetic anomalies that are geometrically perfect matches for some of the famous volcanoes there, but they're not geographic matches. They're not in the same place, almost as though the volcanoes and these magnetic anomalies once did line up, but after a crustal shift, they didn't anymore. This really could have been a 6-hour documentary. There is a lot still to do. We're not going anywhere, and a lot of the people that we heard from in this documentary, they are on board, continuing to do research, committed to do the research. Many of them are coming to Observing the Frontier 2020, where a lot of the updates and new information will come out. Really, this is just the beginning of the story of the end.